Mother, wife,
Air Force veteran,
gun rights advocate.
This is Stacy on the Right. Here's your host, Stacy Washington.
Hello. Stacy on the Right here. Welcoming into the program, Professor Alexander William Salter, economics professor at the Rawls College of Business at Texas Tech University. He's a researcher at TTU's Free Market Institute. Professor Salter, thanks for coming on.
Good to be back, Stacy. How are you?
I'm doing well, and I'm so glad that you're here. You have an op-ed that you wrote for the American Institute for Economic Research, and this is very important for us to have an understanding of. Tell us about what you were writing about this week.
That's right. I finished a research article that's meant for a popular audience, actually, on this idea of central bank independence. So what exactly are we talking about when we say, oh, the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States, is independent? What do economists mean? What do people in the financial press mean? And why is this idea good? Why does everybody view an independent central bank as something that's desirable? The standard line on this is you want your central bank to be independent from political control, and that's what we're ultimately talking about here. Because if politicians had too much control over monetary policy, you'd be worried they might do something like goose the economy in the run-up to an election to increase their chances of getting reelected, taking the inevitable consequences down the road, because whenever you goose the economy with easy money, it's going to create inflation eventually. I think that story makes sense. It's not ridiculous, but at the same time, we need to recognize a more basic legal and constitutional issue here. The Federal Reserve is not an independent constitutional actor. It's created by Congress. The Constitution of the United States vests the monetary policy powers in Congress, and Congress has delegated it to the Fed. So it is right and proper that elected officials in Congress assembled oversee and ultimately control the Fed. A truly independent central bank, one that answers to nobody but itself, is not just an economic solecism, it's frankly unconstitutional.
Okay, so I often will stumble onto an account, and I'll go down a rabbit hole where this individual, usually someone on the younger side, but sometimes it's older individuals as well, and they'll be arguing that we don't actually need a central bank, and that the central bank, meaning the Federal Reserve, is the reason why we have, and then they'll list off a whole bunch of different things like inflation or, something that isn't net bad for our society. Can you talk to us about why the Federal Reserve is something we need and why we need it? And you said it's a creation of Congress, so at least we know that's where it comes from. I think a lot of people who argue against it don't really know its history, but what's the reason why we absolutely must have a central bank?
That's a great question. And even though it's a complicated question, I think it has a pretty simple answer, which is we don't absolutely need a central bank. Early in the 20th century, the Congress of the United States decided to create one because it thought that it was the best feasible solution to fixing what was wrong with the then existing national banking system. And let's make no mistake, the national banking system was highly flawed, but central banking wasn't the only option available. You could have gone the route that economists call free banking. Instead of having more government control over money and finance, you would have less government control over money and finance. I don't think a lot of Americans realize that from the late 18th century, when our nation was born, up until the creation of the Fed, the purchasing power of the dollar had remained, in the long run, virtually unchanged. Yes, during wartime, especially during the Civil War, when the government printed money to help fight it, you'd have inflation. But then after the war, prices would come back down. And it's really rather remarkable that the dollar's purchasing power was stable for so long. And the reason for that is obvious. You might be able to print paper money, but you can't print gold. So ultimately, if prices go up, they got to come back down. In the 20th century, 1913, Congress said that it wanted to fix the national banking system by creating a quasi-clearinghouse system that we now call the Federal Reserve, basically help banks clear their liabilities against each other and provide some emergency liquidity. Eventually, that grew on to exercise what we now recognize as monetary policy power. So the Federal Reserve is something that really grew into itself. But we could have taken a very different approach. We could have taken a more decentralized, private enterprise-focused approach rather than a centralized, government-centric approach. I'm not sure that way forward is feasible now. History is real. We can't always get choices back, but it's possible to have a very strong economy without a central bank. It is not a necessity.
Okay, so I really appreciate that, and I kind of knew going in with that question that you'd be able to answer it. I think a lot of people aren't willing to just simply kind of look at what is what is, and it is kind of hard to squeeze the toothpaste back into the original container, right? You can put it in another container, but you can't squeeze it back into the original. And so that leads to my next question, because I know the dust up between Fed Chair Powell and President Trump has calmed down just a hair, only to kind of be reignited by President Trump's recent statements about the $900 billion in extra borrowing costs that we are spending because the Fed chair won't lower the rates. And so it's not President Trump's decision who the Fed chair is. Mr. Powell's term on the Federal Reserve Bank is actually not over when his term as chair ends. So he'll still be there, but he might not be the chair anymore. He's indicated that he only plans to lower rates twice more this year, which appears not to be in line with what other Fed chairs have done in similar economic circumstances. Things are actually looking quite well, considering it's only 5 months into President Trump's term, and we had a whole lot of really, it was a lot of volatility surrounding the negotiations over the tariffs, but that has actually gone surprisingly well. Do you think the rate should be lowered, and do you think the Fed chair will be swayed at all by the comments that President Trump is making?
I do think that right now interest rates are slightly too high, as determined by the economic fundamentals. By that, I mean they could stand to be about 50 to 100 basis points lower. I can understand the Fed's caution. They very clearly got burned by inflation starting in 2022. Inflation is transitory. Inflation is transitory. Well, then we had several years of above target inflation. American workers lost part of their paychecks to inflation, right? The purchasing power of those dollars got eroded, and everybody was hopping mad about it, and rightly so. And so I think right now key Fed decision makers, including Chairman Powell, want to make sure that the inflationary pressures in the economy, which appear to have moderated, are truly under control before they loosen monetary policy. Now, you got to worry that they might hang on too far the other way. If you keep monetary policy too tight for too long, that can also create costs for the economy in the terms of foregone jobs and foregone output, right, real income that people could be earning. But in some sense, their hesitation is understandable. So far, Chairman Powell has not been terribly receptive to the president's requests for easier monetary policy, and I suspect he's going to want to go out looking like somebody who withstood political pressure rather than giving into it. So I wouldn't expect any more than 2 interest rate cuts the rest of this year, starting not in the summer, but during the fall.
And then when you say basis points, translate that into things that we can understand as we're driving across the country, because our audience is very savvy, but might be thinking, okay, I can't remember if that's a quarter point, eighth of a point. What is that? What will that translate into if the interest rates are currently just above 6?
Yeah, that basically means 0.5% to 1%. So if we're looking at the interest rate that economists call the federal funds rate, sometimes abbreviated as the Fed funds rate, that's like the short-term target interest rate that you always hear about in the financial press. If you read a story in the Wall Street Journal and it says the Fed cut interest rates yesterday, they're talking about the Fed funds rate, which is the rate that banks will actually loan each other money on a very short-term basis to settle their balances with each other. Right now, the Fed wants that to be somewhere between 4.25 and 4.5%. Based on economic fundamentals, I think that 3.25 to 3.5 would be more appropriate, since, again, inflation in the recent months has really slowed down. And when that happens, a given market interest rate actually corresponds to even more expensive credit, because you have to adjust market interest rates for inflation to figure out how much your cash is actually earning. So the Fed, as you can see, has a very difficult job, right? It's constantly chasing the Goldilocks condition, not too hot, not too cold, just right. As an aside, that's why I personally favor more rule-bound monetary policy rather than discretionary, judgment-based monetary policy. It's really hard to do this well if you're constantly making snap judgments in the moment. It's better to sort of constrain yourself to following a rule that you know is good, so you can take the variability out of your decisions and, more importantly, give markets a firm expectation about what you're going to do in the future.
I so agree with that, because then it takes the accusation that something you're doing is political. It removes that completely. You don't have to worry about people saying, oh, you're only taking this action or refusing to take that action because you don't like this president or you don't like this, whatever the political entity is. I do wish we had a little bit more of that evidence, because then Americans could be confident that they could plan on, it's going to be a couple of interest rate hikes or lowerings, or you can look forward to that. You can plan. You can say, it looks like we're going to be winter house shopping because that's when rates will have dropped down a little bit more and it'll be more affordable. Right now, he's saying he's looking at the 2 rate cuts. That's not firm enough for me. I don't feel like him looking at those 2. I know that means he thinks he's going to make those happen. But yeah, I'd like a little bit something more.
And I think that this ultimately gets back to what we started talking about this evening, central bank independence, because it's Congress's job to step in and provide more guidance if the Fed is not doing it voluntarily. Congress could, if it wanted to, force the Federal Reserve to follow a monetary policy rule. What the Fed has right now is called the dual mandate. Most people who follow central banking or financial press matters understand the dual mandate refers to full employment and stable prices, right? Those are the instructions that Congress has given the Fed. Those are the goals that the central bank has to try and achieve. But how low does inflation have to be to qualify as stable prices? How many jobs qualifies as full employment? Nobody knows. Congress hasn't said, so the Fed largely gets to make these things up for itself, which means that the Fed has de facto become a judge in its own cause, right? It gets to determine whether it itself is doing a good job or not. So we shouldn't be surprised that the Fed pretty much always says, we've investigated ourselves and find that we're doing just fine. So it's Congress's responsibility to get involved and say, no, Federal Reserve, in the span of a little more than 10 years, we've had a crippling global financial crisis and then backbreaking inflation. This thing has gotten out of hand. We're going to actually put some stronger guardrails on this process. You don't necessarily want members of Congress making day-to-day interest rate decisions, but it's absolutely appropriate for legislators to say, okay, we're going to hand you a stable dollar rule, and by a stable dollar, we mean no more than X% inflation. Hit that, and if you don't, there will be consequences. I really think that we need something like that to introduce some responsibility into this decision process.
I do, too. I agree with you, and I think the longer we kind of have this, it feels willy-nilly. And that's not monetary policy that we want for anything. Like, we don't really have a American populace that respects a kind of feelings-based approach when it comes to our money. We want facts, we want data, we want hardcore decision making by people that we trust. And I don't know that enough Americans actually trust the Fed chair, not because it's Powell, but just because the Fed itself, the Federal Reserve, it kind of has a bad reputation online for people who actually know or think they know what it is.
I think that that's right. Chairman Powell seems like a decent guy who's trying as hard as he can, as earnestly as he can, to do a very, very difficult job. The problem is ultimately institutional. If all we had to confront was a bad Fed chair or a subpar plurality on the Board of Governors, that would be a relatively straightforward fix, right? Just get the bad people out, put the good people in. But that's not ultimately what's going on here. We have a problem that much more closely resembles, interestingly enough, the problems of constitutional design that the founders confronted, right? If men were angels, nobody would need government. But because men are not angels, we better get the rules of the game right. Well, when it comes to monetary policy, the rules of the game are not right. We've got bad rules, so we're getting bad outcomes. You can't just switch out the players. You've got to change the rules.
So now I wanted to return back to your article and talk a little bit more. So you mentioned central bank independence, and in your article you talk about 4 kinds of central bank independence. And I think this is really interesting because it helps us to kind of wrap our minds around some of this more heady, the more heady aspects of the subject itself, which is the central bank, which you helped us with in the outset. I had a kind of a tough question. You totally blew it out of the park. We've got that down. So what are these four kinds of central bank independence?
That's right. So you have personnel independence. A central bank has personnel independence if it can pick its officials without undue political interference. You have financial independence, that the central bank does not need to rely on the legislature to get its material or financial resources. You have goal independence, that the central bank can actually decide for itself what goals it wants to go after. And you have the most technical one, economists call this instrument independence, if the Fed can choose the tools that it has in its tool belt to actually try and achieve its goals. Now, when we're looking at the Federal Reserve specifically, in terms of day-to-day operations, the Fed has a lot of all of these kinds of independence. First and most importantly, the Fed does not need to rely on the congressional appropriations process to get money. It funds itself through its monetary policy activities. It creates money, it buys assets, those assets yield a rate of return. That rate of return is how the Fed funds itself. It has a large degree of personnel independence. It's true that personnel for high office in the Fed have to be nominated by the president and appointed by the Senate, but once you're there, you're pretty much there for life. You can only be removed, quote, for cause, unquote, and no one's really sure what that means because no one's ever been removed for cause yet. And so the removal power here, either impeachment by Congress or removal by the president, is highly unclear. In practice, once you've got the job, it's yours until your term expires. And in terms of the other kinds of independence, we've already talked about how Congress has been reluctant to get too involved in telling the Fed what goals it should achieve and how it should achieve those goals. So, yeah, on a day-to-day basis, the Fed is calling its own shots. The fact of the matter remains that constitutionally, legally, all of these are delegations of power from the legislature. The Constitution is very clear. Article 1, Section 8, the monetary policy powers belong to Congress. Congress has delegated those powers to the Fed, and if Congress wanted to, it could change how those powers are expressed, or it could even recall those powers. So we have this strange combination of the Fed actually enjoying lots of day-to-day independence because legislatures don't want to mess with it, but constitutionally, it's not supposed to have that. Congress is supposed to be calling the shots.
So that's pretty interesting because what we see in the dust-up between President Trump and Fed Chair Powell is people saying, oh, well, Trump's the president, he should be in charge. And people who don't like Trump saying, the Fed doesn't fall under him, he has no power there. It's Powell. We want to support him as a knee-jerk reaction to President Trump's statements and their dislike of Trump. So this is a completely different thing you're posing here, the actual way it works, right? You're talking about the actual lay of the land, the rules as they stand based on who created what and who's in charge of it. I don't think I could find 100 Americans who know that.
It is pretty complicated. It is rather opaque. And frankly, the Federal Reserve tries pretty hard not to be understood because they have this great reputation as a somewhat mystical, macroeconomic, technocratic institution that sort of tinkers with interest rates here, buys some assets there, and that's going to keep jobs growing and keep income growing for Americans. And you're not supposed to look at it too closely. You're supposed to just let the experts do what they do best. The problem with that is in recent years, the experts have really not done that great of a job. And so it's only a matter of time before Americans are going to think, hey, wait a minute, why do we have this massive and largely unaccountable institution making decisions with no accountability such that when they make mistakes, hundreds of millions of Americans feel the consequences? That doesn't sound like a very good system. It sounds like a rather fragile system. And part of the problem is it's evolved over years and years to look the way it does today. Nobody really planned it. Nobody determined it. It's largely the result of bureaucratic expediency rather than economic principle. And so I, for one, would really like Congress to actually get its act together, to wake up and to say we need to put more guardrails on the Fed. I actually have a rather orthodox take in terms of what I want the president to do, which is not a whole lot. If you look at the history of presidents trying to influence Fed chairs, there is some stuff there that looks economically suspect. So I think that this debate about whether who's in charge, is President Trump in charge or is Chairman Powell in charge, My answer would be I want door number 3. I want option C. The Constitution says it's supposed to be the legislative branch. So how about the legislative branch actually legislate something about this? That sure would be nice.
I would like you to share anything else you'd like us to know about it. I was basically kind of summing up and saying that I'm so grateful that you've explained so much of this to us tonight, but I want all Americans to understand the function of the Federal Reserve and for it not to be so politicized, because monetary policy impacts all of us, no matter if we're Republicans or Democrats. Anything else you'd like to add to what you've shared tonight?
Absolutely. If I had one thing that I wanted to convince your listeners, it's that you don't need to take a back seat when these conversations and debates about the Fed and monetary policy become aired in public. This is not a matter only for experts. This is not only a matter for people with advanced degrees in macroeconomics. All government institutions are subject to reflection and choice. That is a basic constitutional principle. It's your right as American citizens to engage in these conversations and deliberate on these issues. And it's quite obvious to most Americans that the existing institutions and rules and policies and procedures we've had for managing the dollar, for figuring out how monetary policy is going to affect job growth, affect income growth, hasn't been working for most people. We've had this big experiment since COVID. The Fed massively expanded its balance sheet, purchased a ton of assets that hadn't previously purchased, and then was all surprised when inflation manifested and got out of control. Americans have legitimate concerns with that. Get involved. Write to your representative. Tell them that you want them to look into this issue. I would encourage everyone to understand that this is not something that we can afford to leave to people with fancy degrees and prestigious jobs or visiting positions at the Federal Reserve or universities or anything like that. To paraphrase, I think, a quote from de Gaulle, monetary policy is far too important to be entrusted to central bankers.
It is. It really is. And what I want is for us to have a better understanding. We need far more time spent on this, and for people to have a clear understanding of what's going on. It's so good to have you here, Professor Salter. Thank you for coming on the show and for your time tonight.
My pleasure. You have a good one.
All right, you too.